Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus and we are back to Whipping Girl, specifically chapter 14, Trans-Sexualization. And since it's been a while since we've been with Julia Serano, I want to make sure that I give my disclaimer and all the fun stuff around that. Julia Serano wrote Whipping Girl in 2005, and it was published in 2007. From what I've heard, it's a collection of essays that she had originally written on her website and then edited it and added onto it for the book. And for what it's worth, while I am coming at this as a person who has had this book shoved in front of my face multiple times by other transgender people telling me I need to read this and I'll understand why transgender phobia does not exist and why trans misogyny is not applicable to anyone but trans women and trans feminine leaning people. I also want to recognize the fact that as much since I've pinged her for not crediting older outdated works for the good that they did. And I need to say the same for Julia Serano. As much as her stuff is now currently out of date, as much as there is exorcistic, exorcexist, and transgender phobic, and it's very perisex focused materials, as well as some racist stuff from when we covered the chapter talking about third gender identities in other cultures, and she basically said they're all actually trans feminine identities and referencing a college educated white man as she is a college educated white woman and not going to the source herself. But Julia Serano did create some great milestones. She's the one that is credited with coining the term trans misogyny. Without her, we wouldn't have these foundations to be talking about trans misogyny, transgender phobia in these specific ways. So I do want to give her credit for that. That said, I am still allowed to critique her work as someone who is reading this in the year 2023, just as she is allowed to critique the 60s and 70s textbooks that were created and the studies that are now very obviously considered outdated. Unfortunately for us, she doesn't acknowledge the good in history that they did. She only wants to demonize it. And I'm doing a lot of demonizing myself because I don't like her work. I apologize for Nettle. She's mad that I took her bone away. As with any of these, I'm going to start off by reading my summary that I actually wrote at work because I lost my original summary. So I was processing this in between checking people out. Chapter 14 talks about trans women being sexualized in various contexts, from the fetishization IRL and in media to the inaccurate models of transsexuality purported by the likes of Ray Blanchard. This chapter may be the clearest example of Whipping Girl being originally a collection of essays, not yet confirmed by me, and Serano's clear resentment to the patriarchy, particularly men. We'll get into it with quotes later. Mentions of trans men are mercifully few, and non-binary or intersex experiences are, of course, completely omitted. This chapter also holds the most assumptions I've seen, and it is in large part because of a lack of research into the topics of cis male attraction to trans women. Unfortunately, it appears Serano chose to use her assumptions and broader feminist attitudes to place certain beliefs into these men, much like how modern feminists gloss over the genuine problems that can and do drive men to men's rights activists in MGTOW culture. Serano talks a lot about the predator-prey concept of heterosexuality and spends most of the chapter showing how trans women break said concept, ignoring, of course, non-binary trans men and cis homosexuality doing the same thing. However, she never really engages with the concept beyond a superficial reading outside of how it affects trans women. Now, this would be excusable to most people because this entire book is centered on trans women, but this chapter in particular places a lot of emphasis on cis heterosexual males' roles and the predator-prey dynamic, as well as male socialization. Because this book is often used to counter my arguments for men's suffering, this attitude Serano gives as fact is reflected in those arguments, and Serano is responsible for that. And then it goes into me doing rent and stuff. And another part that I want to mention is she talks about male socialization for those trans women that grew up thinking that they were male, identifying as male, until it no longer jived and they transitioned to female or recognize themselves as women, even if they don't transition. And I feel like with her recognizing male socialization and the cis-het male mindset of predator prey, yeah, it's once again one of those incomplete ideas. So we'll start off with the very first paragraph. I never fully appreciated what it meant to be sexualized when I was male bodied. Back then, I would sometimes overhear men shouting lewd comments at women or deliberately turning their heads to ogle women as they walked by. At the time, I assumed that the men who committed such acts were simply expressing a form of sexual interest, albeit in a rude and adolescent manner. While other men may have experienced a similar attraction to the women in question, I thought most were apparently respectful enough not to vocalize such thoughts publicly. In this sense, catcalls reminded me of those bad teen sex comedies, undoubtedly crude and obnoxious but relatively harmless. In retrospect, I now realized that this interpretation was largely enabled by the fact that I had not been on the receiving end of such acts before. I write, this entire paragraph is interesting to me because Serano opts to frame sexualization purely as male looking at female. Anyone who knows me knows I spend so much time on Reddit and am disgusted by how swept under the rug male expressions of discomfort towards sexual harassment and advances are. But, combined with the next line, it also shows the good old to get to the men, you have to frame it as if they're the ones being harassed or their daughters, moms, wives. Which I don't think is a bad method to make people care about shit, by the way. I just find it interesting because the vibes I get from Serrano's work and Twitter would make her very antithetical to that sort of moral framework. It also just hits something that she's framing this type of sexual harassment as universal, as does the rest of the world. It ignores the fact there are very much women facing appearing individuals who in fact never go through this, and it can fuck with their psyche quite a lot. And the next line that I'm talking about is her saying, my perspective changed radically almost immediately after I began hormone therapy. In fact, one of the first indications I had that others were beginning to gender me as female was the occasional sexual innuendo that I received from strange men as I walked down city streets. And she goes on and talks a bit about something, her still being in boy mode but still being identified as female. She's talked in the past about how within a couple of months she started being seen as female. Her experience with physical transition is so unlike my own and so unlike so many people, where she seemed to have very little difficulty going from male to female, and I'm not sure she recognizes that privilege that she has. Is not here nor there, and it's just another one of those things that I feel like unconsciously influence her work, if that makes sense. Anyway, she goes on and talks about the difference between sexual desire and sexualization. And one thing that I'm highlighting is sexual desirability is something that we all hope to have to some extent, which is untrue. We have asexuality and a romanticism where potentially people don't want to be seen as sexually or romantically desired. And that is something that I just wanted to highlight. Again, this was 2005 to 2007, so asexuality was not talked about as much during that time as it is today. So it may have simply been her being completely ignorant, though she likes to talk about how she's talked to many people in various situations, cis and trans. And I mean, asexuality, while it was less talked about, was a thing. Avon's been around since before this book was published, so Let's see. Scrolling down. Some might naively argue that these women have power, specifically the power to lure men, but it's a power that only serves heterosexual male interest. After all, how much power is there in being a carrot on a stick dangled in front of someone? And this is about women who are considered sexually desirable. All right, this is so very much a reaction to media in 2005 to 2007. I'm thinking of how sexy but powerful women like Buffy were used as pinnacle feminism back in the day, though we know now that Joss Whedon isn't exactly a shining monolith of unimpeachable creation. But it's kind of like how every other piece of media I've been able to watch and judge on my own since starting Serano's book. It feels an awful lot like Serano disliking some aspect of womanhood being thrust upon her. The overly pink depictions in movies like Legally Blonde or Badass in a Cheerleader's Uniform Buffy. And because these attributes have been and were frequently misused by male creators, she's deemed them all bad. I really would hope she doesn't hold this view so black and white today. Women should be allowed to own their sexuality, including the parts that do exert powers over others. Perhaps if she'd seen the new Velma drooling over her femme fatale villain crush, she would have had a different thought on this back in the day. And this was Trick or Treat Scooby Doo, not the new Velma, the new Velma, the TV show from HBO Max, which is an entirely different. It's entirely different. Okay, now we talk about the predator prey mindset, and I highlight this bit. This predator prey mindset makes it virtually impossible for us to imagine that a woman has the potential to be a sexual aggressor, evident in the common disbelief about and inability to articulate instances of woman on woman sexual violence or female fetishism, or that a man can be a sexual object, as seen by the tendency for people to view young boys who are seduced by adult women as being lucky, as opposed to being victims of statutory rape. In fact, the only instances in which adult men seem to have the potential to become sexual objects is when they are sexualized or coerced into sexual acts by male aggressors. I'm highlighting this mostly because the female on female violence has always been something that I've mentioned when there's been pushback on trans women in women's prisons and single sex spaces. But also, she completely ignores adult women going after adult men. And that is already a vastly underrepresented part of sexual abuse, sexual trauma, sexual harassment. She is completely ignoring that and how common it is and how common the jokes are. And this is going to be really big because next week I am talking about Velma, the HBO Max show. And there's a lot of male body shaming for Fred. And it's supposed to be funny because Fred is the rich white character, so he's a heterosexual, supposedly cisgender man who hasn't gone through puberty despite being tall and broad. And much is made about the size of his phallus. And it's the fact that this is explicitly ignoring that is in itself a continuation of this idea of the predator prey mindset, making it impossible to think of it in that way. All right, then going on, there are movies that depict some trans women being deviant or deranged and going after cis women, and she highlights The Silence of the Lambs, where the transsexual character, Buffalo Bill, neither lives nor physically transitions to female, and his supposed transsexuality is treated simply as a psychosis that drives them to commit violence. I'm only highlighting that because I've heard a lot about Buffalo Bill being a trans woman, and in the novel and in the movie, it is a throwaway line. There's a lot of problems with how this is depicted, I know, but it is made a point of that Buffalo Bill is not trans. He just fetishizes womanhood, and that's it. He is the thing that people don't like. But they make a point of saying, no, he is not transgender. That is why he's not been allowed to transition, because he's not meeting the requirements of being trans. And I mean, according to her own writing, under blank cards, like two transgender women things, the autogynephilic and the homosexual ones, they would still allow the autogynephilic ones to transition. So there's a disconnect. Going on down, talking about the porn industries. In contrast, trans men are not objectified by straight identified men to nearly the same extent. Trans male porn, what little of it there is, attracts a predominantly gay male and queer female audience. And I write, why? Why include this? You yourself admit there is very little here to even judge on, and yet the very little you give speaks volumes. Why is it so much more popular with queer women? What sort of depictions of trans men are there in gay porn? Do they do a lot of the penetrating, or are they almost always being penetrated? Because I can tell you what I found through my own porn search history. If you aren't going to devote more than a second or two to trans men in porn, don't bring them up at all, especially after your throwaway line about how women can assault other women or boys. It's so irritating. She didn't have to bring up trans men at all, because she's talking about how trans women are depicted in porn, and I have nothing against this. There's the idea of the trans women are very often treated as sexual objects in porn, especially straight porn. And there are some instances of trans. Well, it's more common now, I believe, but there's also a lot of femdom with trans women. But that's getting into the whole thing. We're not going to discuss it. The point is, she could have made her point about trans women in porn without bringing trans men in at all, and without highlighting the fact that trans men are being fetishized by queer women. Like, how do you put in there that trans male porn is popular with queer women, and don't stop and think about the fact that that might be a problem? What type of queer women? Is it bisexual women? Is it lesbian women? Why are lesbian women getting off to male bodies? We talk a lot about how trans women are fetishized by straight men. This is mostly what this chapter is about. But the fact that trans men are fetishized by queer women, it's not a problem, I guess. It's not something to discuss, I guess. Maybe she thinks of it as a privilege that we're being looked at by queer women, like how we're let into these turf, trans women excluded, women only spaces. And she's upset about that and doesn't stop to think about the fact that this is misgendering or degendering trans men. And the trans men and non binary people who are going into these spaces are doing so and invalidating their own gender identity to enter these spaces, and what that means about the internalized misogyny, the internalized self-loathing. Anyway, in my own experience, I have found that the way I'm sexualized as a trans woman is similar to how I'm sexualized when I'm presumed to be a cisgender woman, i.e., I'm sexually objectified rather than seen as an aggressor. Invariably, though, the former is more invasive and debasing. And she talks about how when she's seen as a trans woman, she gets more invasive comments, more sexual advances, more sexually explicit conversations that she doesn't get when she's seen as cis. She also didn't say cisgender, I put that. Then scrolling down a bit, talking about going on to talking about why trans women might be so subjected to this sort of harassment. Some might suggest that the reason why I experience more hardcore sexualization as a trans woman has to do with the fact that transsexuals are rather rare, thus leading others to view us as exotic. While rareness may contribute to this phenomenon, I don't believe that it's a sufficient explanation. After all, there are plenty of types of women who are relatively rare, but they are not all sexualized in the same manner that trans women are. East Asian women might want to have a word with her. There's far more East Asian women, and I mean Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, who are around than trans women. At least I'm guessing. Sorry, I don't have statistics in front of me. But there are a lot of East Asian women who get fetishized and sexually objectified and sexually harassed by non East Asian men because they are different. They are quote unquote exotic. And she's just like, no, it's not that. Clearly, this is something unique just to us, and is not an experience that might be shared with other types of women. All right. So there's this thing that she talks about is like, when I make it clear to the men that I don't like this. In fact, many catcallers seem to enjoy provoking these very feelings of insult or embarrassment in the women they harass. I find that the men who sexualize me as a trans woman are often dumbfounded and angered by my unwillingness to engage them on a sexually explicit level. I've even had a man accuse me of misleading him, as if the only legitimate reason for me to be out as a transsexual was to signal my sexual availability or to solicit sexual attention from men. This assumption that I am somehow asking for it is eerily similar to the attitudes some men have towards women who they believe are dressed or behaving in a sexually provocative fashion. Going on. Once again, this sort of thinking stems directly from predator-prey power dynamic, where a woman can never truly be seen as a sexual aggressor, only a sexual object. Thus, women who do take sexual initiative are not considered to be preying on men per se, but rather opening themselves up to or inviting male sexual aggression. So, I highlighted all that. And I was reading through this, and I'm reading and I'm thinking about how with trans women, the assumption of they are men, they are male, they are masculine, going through that line of thinking, maybe in addition to this usual debasement, this harassment, this idea of power over women that we get through catcalling, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, that sort of thing. When men are shocked that a trans woman, an openly out trans woman, is not engaging with them on the same sexual level, I think it has just as much to do with the reason why they're so surprised is because on some level they're thinking of the trans woman as a former man, and thus on some level have that same sexual forwardness, or they see this as a chance to be open sexually aggressive in a way that they might not have been with a cisgender woman. And I find it interesting Serano doesn't want to think about it in that way, because she does like to talk about how people don't see trans women as women, which I agree. And the fact that this could be a subconscious or even a conscious thing from the men, it's very interesting to me because it has to do with how we maybe not even totally realize what we're doing when we're looking at other people as potential sexual partners. And that's just as off the top of my head as some of the stuff that she's saying, because there's not a whole lot of citations that I've passed through yet. Scrolling down a bit, here's talking about sexual violation. And then going on to, in this context, I would argue that trans women are hypersexualized in our culture because we are viewed as enabling our own sexual objectification. by virtue of the fact that we physically transition from male to female, in much the same way that a woman who wears a low-cut dress is presumed to facilitate her own objectification. The idea that trans women deliberately transform ourselves into women to invite male sexualization and sexual advances is perhaps the most popular assumption made about trans women. No citation, by the way. According to this myth, trans women do not prey on men so much as we lure them by turning ourselves into sexual objects that no red-blooded man can resist. Framing the matter this way not only relieves men of any responsibility for their own sexual actions, but also prevents them from being cast in the role of sexual object or prey, an inherently subordinate position. Further, this tactic insinuates that trans women's physical transitions are centered on the desires of men in much the same way that people presume that women who wear highly feminine or revealing outfits do so not for themselves but in order to attract male attention. So, again, there's no citations on what I just read. So all of this is her understanding of what she's read, what she's experienced, talked to other people about, and really does encompass feminism in that time and period. And I can't help but continue on with my previous thought about how cis men may be viewing trans women as former men on some level. Maybe they also see trans women as they're able to be more direct with them. It's still gross, it's still disgusting, it's still sexual harassment, but there's something about the fact that they are so much more likely to be so much more forward with a trans woman and get offended when they may not be offended with a cisgender woman. I think it has as much to do with the fact that they see trans women as formerly men and expect that the trans woman to have the same sort or reciprocate that sort of sexually aggressive manner. I don't disagree with the idea that there's this whole predator prey dynamic that men don't want to be put into an inherently subordinate thing on some level, with very certain exceptions, but this feels very one note, and that is why when I come across people trying to use this book as a counter argument and whatever I'm talking about, their arguments also come across as very one note. This point is crucial. If trans women were seen as changing our sex primarily because we want it to be female, this point is crucial, Serano says. If trans women were seen as changing our sex primarily because we want it to be female, as is generally the case, then male to female transitioning would become both a self-empowering act and one that potentially empowers femaleness itself. I don't know about that. I think even if we were to take away the sexualization of male to female transition in broader culture, which has been happening over time, we would still have a lot of people thinking that it's disempowering. But I don't know. I just wanted to read that to continue to give context to Serrano's work. Let's see. Let's talk about commentary on male to female transitioning. For instance, in media, it seems that the most commonly described effect of male to female hormone therapy is that it causes trans women to develop breasts or curves. While this is certainly true, trans women themselves do not always see the specific change as the most important result of hormone therapy. Duh. Unfortunately, media is going to focus on the most superficial parts of any transition. And anybody who is choosing to undergo transition may have some appreciation of the parts that they are going to gain or the changes that are going to happen. Like, I was very excited about the chance of growing facial hair. and hopefully having clitoral growth. Fortunately, neither of those things are very active for me, but I mostly wanted to transition to start feeling more comfortable in my body. And she makes the point that the psychological and emotional effects of starting estrogen is what is very much desired in trans women. Is like, okay, you're stating the obvious. Moving on down, talking about physical femaleness exists only to experience male penetration. Of course, attempts to focus on male desire when considering male to female transsexuality are undermined by the fact that many trans women are either lesbian or bisexual, which I'm just highlighting because it's. Yeah, she's also just. Okay. You're like, oh, this is ignoring this, and then brushes over it, and less brushing over than she's done with anything about the trans men in porn thing being fetishized by queer women, but not much. Let's see. Moving on. The popular assumption that trans women deliberately transforms ourselves into sexual objects also explains why we're so frequently depicted in the media as sex workers. The fact that trans female sex workers have reached the status of stock characters is of particular interest. Such depictions are completely at odds with other cissexual presumptions about transsexuality. Media representations of trans people that do not involve sex work typically go out of their way to stress the fact that transsexuality is an extraordinarily rare phenomenon and to promote the idea that transsexuals are sexually undesirable. So it is unclear why, being as rare and undesirable as we supposedly are, we seem to make up such a significant percentage of sex workers on TV and in movies. This inconsistency implicitly suggests that trans women must somehow specifically seek out jobs as sex workers, presumably because we so desperately wish to be sexually objectified by men. She then goes on to talk about how there are a lot of trans women who are sex workers due to discrimination and needing to make ends meet. And I'm just, when I was reading this, I got so mad because we know in media and political culture, there is an undercurrent of repressed sexuality that manifests in a lot of people, a lot of these men in power seeking out sex workers, including trans women. So maybe the reason why trans women are depicted so often as sex workers, which is a problem, is because these people creating this media have first run into trans women as sex workers. I'm just saying. Yes, there can be this underlying unconscious undercurrent of the idea that trans women should exist only as sexual objects and they are not good enough to be considered girlfriends or wives. But can we Occam's razor some of this shit? Because she's talking about San Francisco trans sex worker rates. California, very trans friendly. There's a lot of sex workers there. There's a lot of transgender sex workers. There's a lot of transgender sex workers on the East Coast. It's just Serano. She's so intelligent. I'm not going to deny that she's intelligent. She's got a degree in like microbiology. I don't even remember. It's some sort of science field. But the fact that she's writing all of this and she can't stop and think of like, all this media I'm criticizing has a lot of trans women sex workers. There's a lot of suppression of sexuality in the higher ups in political circles. Maybe the reason why I keep seeing transgender women as sex workers in media is because these people go and seek out sex workers and they run into trans women because trans women make up a lot of sex workers in these areas. All right, now we're jumping down to psychiatric discourse about transsexuality and sexuality. Similarly, in psychiatric discourses regarding transsexuality, in which trans women are labeled and conceptualized as male transsexuals and trans men as female transsexuals, the tendency has been to play down female to male spectrum gender and sexual diversity, while focusing heavily on male to female spectrum transgenderism, due in part to the latter group's presumed male agency. However, it is not simply that male to female spectrum trans people are studied more because they are or used to be male, because psychiatrists who buy into the predator prey dichotomy tend to view expressions of femininity as serving the sole purpose of attracting and appeasing male sexual desire, and view the desire to be female as synonymous with the desire to be sexually objectified. They have consistently tried to frame male to female transgenderism as being driven primarily or exclusively by sexual impulses. I wanted to give that entire thing because, yes, there is a lot more focused on male to female, and going the Blanchard, there is this autogynephilia versus homosexual desire to be a trans woman. I'm going to repeat. The tendency has been to play down female to male spectrum gender and sexual diversity, due in part to the latter group's male to female presumed male agency. I don't know if you remember, but I believe in one of my chapter 7, because I had to do part 1 and 2, she talked a lot about how trans men have an easier time transitioning because psychiatry at the time and to this day is very dominated by men who would have an easier time understanding the different aspects of being a man. But here, trans women have male agency, trans men do not. I find it very interesting that this kind of sort of contradicts her earlier thoughts. And it's part of why I think that these were written as a series of essays that she then rewrote, and she probably doesn't see the contradiction. Or maybe she just didn't think of it as a group when she's talking about trans men because her focus is on trans women. But I see this as a contradiction, and it frustrates me. Moving down, talking a little bit about psychiatric diagnosis of transvestic fetishism, which is so vaguely written as to suggest that all heterosexual men who cross-dress are driven by this sexual paraphilia, which doesn't really mean anything. I don't know why I highlighted it. Okay, so talking about trans people who don't meet the expectations, considering themselves as female. And she writes, so they may initially gravitate towards a cross-dresser identity because it seems to be the only viable alternative for them. This was most certainly true in my case. For me, it was only after I fully explored cross-dressing, eventually finding it to be insufficient to ease my gender dissonance, and had the opportunity to meet several trans women who did not fit the classic transsexual archetype, that I realized that it was actually possible for me to physically transition and live as a somewhat non-conforming woman with regard to gender and sexuality. And again, this is another one of those parts where she spends quite a bit and ends up using her personal experience instead of citing sources. While a subconscious sex that is independent of sexual orientation and gender expression, as I have previously described in Chapter 6, Intrinsic Inclinations, may be the simplest and soundest model to explain why some male cross-dressers eventually come to see themselves as trans women, it has not sat well with certain psychiatrists. This is presumably because the existence of non-heterosexual and non-feminine trans women entirely undermines the predator-prey logic that those researchers take as a given. In the late 1980s, in an apparent attempt to reconcile this issue, psychologist Ray Blanchard put forward a different and more confounding model to explain male-to-female transgenderism. His theory creates a new dichotomy between what he calls autogynephilic and homosexual transsexuals, which recapitulates the predator-prey dichotomy. While Blanchard's controversial theory is built upon a number of incorrect and unfounded assumptions, there are many methodological flaws in the data he offers to support it. It has garnered some acceptance in the psychiatric literature and gained mainstream attention with the publication of psychologist J. Michael Bailey's book, The Man Who Would Be Queen. And we've talked about this a bit in the past before, so I'm just bringing that up as reference. I don't have anything to really say about that. Autogynephilia, like transvestic fetishism before it, exempts those who are deemed homosexual, as they would necessarily undermine the predator-prey dichotomy upon which these theories are built. So instead of assuming that there is a unified basis for transsexuality, i.e. a subconscious sex that is odd with one's physical sex, Blanchard proposes two separate causes for male to female transsexuality in order to accommodate his sexualization of male to female gender identity and expression. And I feel like Serano is trying to once again put on her forward the subconscious sex, which is a fine theory for some people, but as we know, being trans, it doesn't really have any one single origin. So I think she also tries to oversimplify it. Let's see, going on, talking about potential sexual partners and how we see ourselves when we're thinking about sex. In contrast, pre and non transition trans people are unable to take their own physical sex for granted, and thus their sexual fantasies often revolve around physically becoming or being their preferred sex. No citation. Every trans person I've spoke with about this, whether male to female, female to male, homosexual, bisexual, or heterosexual, has said that their sexual fantasies almost always involve on some level their being in the appropriately sexed body. She does not give how many people, she does not cite any studies, she does not cite her own sources. And once again, this is one of those instances where one naysayer can derail her point. Going down, continuing to talk about Blanchard, how men should be able to sexually objectify their own body, but it's autophallophilia, that sort of thing. And the fact that male to female spectrum trans people are the only ones ever accused of sexually objectifying their own gender. Cis-sexual women may be aroused by wearing sexy feminine articles of clothing, and female to male spectrum trans folks may be turned on by the thought of having a penis, but because these groups are considered female, in the eyes of many psychiatrists at any rate, they are not deemed to be legitimate sexual aggressors. And here we are, full proof, her saying psychiatrists see trans men as women. That is it may have been a stretch earlier, but this is hands down her straight up saying psychiatrists see trans men as women. When earlier she said trans men have an easier time transitioning because the mainly male psychiatrists are able to more easily identify diversity in male experiences. Which one, Serano? Please tell me which one. Moving on. Many people, both within and outside the field of psychiatry, seem so compulsively driven to sexualize male to female gender identities and expressions that they fail to ask a far more relevant and pressing question. How does the ubiquitous and assumed predatory prey dichotomy shape the way that male to female spectrum trans people come to view themselves? I agree. That is a really interesting question. I like that. I wish it didn't come right after her contradicting her own theory that trans men have an easier time transitioning, but I like that question. Let's see. Skipping down a little bit, I would argue that male to female spectrum transsexualities make far more sense once we recognize them as being on the receiving end of cultural messages that sexualize femaleness and femininity, rather than being the perpetrators of such sexualization themselves. Those who fit the so-called true transsexual archetype, i.e. Blanchard's homosexual group, the one that are attracted to trans women who are attracted to men, basically, typically identify as female from an early age and transition relatively early in life. Because they identify as female for much of their lives, they are more likely to absorb the same cultural encouragement that non-trans heterosexual girls do, such as becoming focused on being conventionally attractive and attracting boys. No citation. On the other hand, male to female spectrum trans people who become aware of their cross-gender desires after they have already consciously accepted the fact that they are boys, i.e. Blanchard's autogynephilics, tend to have greater difficulty reconciling their female or feminine inclinations with societal messages that insist that men and women are opposite sexes, and that girls are inferior to boys, Rather than feeling entitled to call themselves female or act outwardly feminine, they often develop intense feelings of shame and self loathing regarding their cross gender inclinations. To cope, they may develop sexual thoughts and fantasies that associate their desire to be female/feminine with subordination, humiliation, and sexual objectification. If anything, these fantasies share more in common with the exhibitionist, submissive, and rape fantasies experienced by many women rather than the sexually aggressive and objectifying fantasies commonly associated with men. Again, no citation. And that's pretty much the end of it. She ends it by talking about how she much rather would be open with her sexual history, that sort of thing. But it's not really important. All in all, it's a very interesting chapter to read. I do think there is a lot to be said about how trans people are sexualized or desexualized in media, and how there can be very contradictory messages even within the same piece of media. From we're talking about like the sex workers versus desexualized trans women who may be queer or that sort of thing. But I get frustrated because she mentions trans men so little in this chapter, but when she does, it's almost like it's designed to infuriate me, however many years later this is. And I don't know, again, if these were a series of essays that she edited and added to and then put it together in a book, or if she wrote this all wholesale. I don't know how she managed to miss the fact that she talked about psychiatrists seeing trans men as men, and then 7 chapters later, I think, she's saying that trans men are seen as female by psychiatrists. But should I be surprised? This is the same person who said that non binary identities are just a partial expression of your subconscious sex, thus, pretty much saying that non binary identities are not legitimate and you are actually binary trans. You just haven't realized it yet. This is also the same woman who will cite plenty of sources, but the moment she starts talking about personal experiences or how she's talked to people and all the people she's talked to agreed with her, she won't give numbers, she won't give names, she won't cite her own studies, and she's a scientist. She knows how important having data is. She calls out Blanchard's methodology because, yeah, his methodology is bullshit. His conclusions are bullshit. Any good he did to the trans community has been erased by this point because we've built up far more solid understandings of what makes a person trans, how to help them transition, how does someone's transition affect them, etc., etc. He may have done good in his time, but he's also done a lot of bad. And that's exactly how I feel about Serano's book, is that she's done a lot of good, but at this point in time, Whipping Girl is is outdated. And while trans misogyny is something that's very important to talk about, trying to use this book in a modern context as a cudgel against certain talking points that maybe you don't agree with, it doesn't work, because this is steeped in trans activism and feminism of the time period that it's rooted in. But clearly, it's time for me to stop. It's nearly midnight, and I have to work tomorrow. And Nettle is going to lick me to death if I don't stop talking. So, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your patience. Look forward to the Velma video next week, because I'm about to go watch the last 2 episodes, and hopefully my landlord isn't angry with me, because I got home and the heat was on, and I was talking to my landlord, and he's like, if the plumbing people turn it on, if the plumbing people turn it on, I was like, if they didn't turn it on, we have a fucking ghost. And he's like, he was upset that I was being unprofessional. And I was just like, you're the one that kept saying if, if. I'm sorry I snapped. I literally just said, I'm sorry that I came across unprofessional. I'll watch my tone in the future, even when I'm frustrated. He said he'll pay a quarter of the electric bill next month. And I'm like, thank you. Because I've had it off since we've talked about shit. God, okay. Uh, one unprofessional incident, I think it's going to be fine. Yeah, it's it's been a long day. Anyway, like I said, look forward to the Velma episode next week. I'm starting classes next week as well. I'm excited. It's going to be great. Uh, it's going to be a busy semester. But yeah, stay hydrated, stay medicated. Good night. Say bye, Ned. Say bye.